ahead and put in the question area if you can, if there's any technical difficulties. Sorry about that. So I'm glad that you can hear me now. Okay, so yeah, good. Okay, thank you guys. That's the thing when it's challenging, you're not in front of, in the same room with everybody. Okay. So one of the things that Michael and I have developed is a school health survey, especially for COVID-19 and as we start re-entering the 2021 school year and beyond. And you're welcome to go ahead and take that survey, and it's available at that URL, and it's in the handout as well. Okay, so let's get at the nitty-gritty. And granted, this is a 1-hour webinar, and really to start opening our minds about grading and assessment, what that looks like in the modern classroom, virtual learning, hybrid learning, or also doing, any kind of context. But what we do know is that, what has happened because of the pandemic, challenges in education that have always bedeviled us are under a magnifying glass in a way that they never have before. And so as far as access and equity and issues of grading and also effective instruction and teaching and learning, it has just been exacerbated in a way that really we have to confront it. We have to confront it. And so one of the things that, of course, was in mainstream media last April and May and June was, how do we assess students? How are we going to grade students, for example, given the pandemic and all of the discrepancies with instruction? And really, it gets at the question, like, what is the purpose of a grading? What is the purpose of assessment? And honestly, I believe, and I'm sure many of you share that, is really to determine what kids know. What have they mastered? What have they been able to secure as far as skills and content knowledge? And that's what we're getting at, rather than it being about compliance. And unfortunately, I think that has been the habit for quite some time. So the big picture is this, is that some of the questions that we're going to look at is, why does grading and assessment need to look different? Why does it have to look different in the 21st century? And I would say that there's an urgency to it that needs to be addressed. And the second, I actually was online with a middle school last week in Washington State, and we were starting to talk about, grading and how that needs to change in the 21st century, or what they're working on right now. We're going to look at the building blocks of formative assessment, because that's really the core of the conversation. That's the foundation of any conversations that we have about grading and assessment in the modern classroom, and really looking at Jim Popham and Margaret Heritage's work. And that A, B, C, D, and F is an absolutely obsolete system. It needs to go. And I'm going to share the argument for that as well. And then I want to talk a little bit, we could have a series of webinars just on proficiency scales, skills-based grading. Some folks call it standards-based grading. And, we can start having some conversations about both, but that's a pretty in-depth topic as well. So in the handouts, there's a lot of resources too for standards-based grading and formative assessment, to go ahead and look at that. But I want to start the conversation today about shoes, actually, shoes and letter grades, and actually what they have in common. And I shared the blog post that I wrote about where the origin of letter grades came from. And for me, I'm always curious. My undergraduate major, my bachelor's degree, is actually American Studies. And so I'm always interested in history and, researching and digging kind of like those big social historical questions. And I wanted to know where A, B, C, D, F came from. Who decided this? Where did it come from? Well, it's actually a kind of interesting story. It has very little to do with education. It has everything to do with shoes, which is rather interesting and ironic, right? And basically, in the 18th century, the way that academics were paid was by the number of students that they had, and they were tutors, actually. So there was this tutor at Cambridge University who soon realized that, if he had more students, if he was able to take on more students, he'd be able to make more money. So he looked at the shoe cobblers. He looked at the cobblers in the village in Cambridge, and he looked at how they sell shoes. And they literally had an A grade, B grade, C grade, D grade based on the quality of the shoe. So if the cobbler was considered to be A grade level, then their shoes were advertised or promoted as A grade level shoes, and you paid more for that. And the elite paid for them, and the ones that were less skilled or didn't have the same level of the quality of materials or leather or raw materials were lower, and they cost less. So he came up with a system similar to what the cobblers did of having criterion for being able to give grades. And by doing that, he was able to take on more students. So an A student was able to accomplish these 5 things, then the B student accomplished this, and then C and D. And because he had a systematic system of compliance that and criterion in order to get an A grade, a B grade, a C grade, or a D grade, he was able to take on more students. Well, the idea quickly caught on, and many universities in Europe started doing the same thing. They realized that if they took on more students, they could get more money and more tuition dollars, and actually be able to offer education to more individuals, because you could teach more people rather than having those small groups and those 2 sessions. And it's really quite interesting. So it really doesn't have anything to do with the quality of learning or what skills you develop or the content knowledge. It has to do with buckets that you fill in order to have an A grade, B grade, C grade, D grade. And it's actually quite fascinating. And I included that blog post in the research that I did in your handouts. So really what grades are about is not so much a measure about learning. It's more of a criterion, an artificial criterion that has to be fulfilled, similar to the manufacturer of shoes. Okay, so with that in mind, with that context, let's look at formative assessment for a moment, okay? And how many of you are familiar with formative assessment? You know about it. You may have maybe taken some professional, you've read about it, it's something that's in practice. How many of you already do? And just in the questionnaire, yeah, I'm familiar with it, I'm an expert about it and such. And if you would go ahead and populate that in the question area, I'm gonna go ahead with this slide and I'll come back and check. And so what is formative assessment exactly? Well, a lot of folks think that it's a particular kind of measurement or instrument or tool. And with the surgence of the new standards about 10 years ago, there were a lot of companies who would say, oh, and we have a formative assessment plan too, which was oftentimes multiple choice quizzes or tests that were considered benchmarks that went along this continuum of 40 weeks. And that's not really, that's not accurate. So it's not a particular measurement or instrument or tool. It's really a process. And I want to say that again, is that it's a process and it's integral to effective teaching and learning. So that process is very different thinking than product. It's not something that you buy or it's one way of doing it. It's really that loop that we have to understand how our students are learning, and as a teacher, how my instruction is making an impact, okay? And so so a lot of you are familiar with this and that you use it. Yep. Okay, great. So we have some familiarity there as well, and it looks like our sound is in good shape too, so I'm glad to hear that. So what are some qualities of effective formative assessment? And I'm just giving these introductory slides so we're all on the same page, because what I find with education is that I have to define my terms a lot. You know, if I say something like differentiated instruction, there's probably 50 interpretations of what, differentiated instruction is, or if I talk about integrated literacy. So I just want to make sure that everybody understands really the direction that I'm coming from on this. And I really rely quite a bit on Jim Popham's work and Margaret Heritage. They are two of the most important influences and foundational theorists and researchers about formative assessment. And the key to it is that teachers make adjustments to teaching and learning in response to assessment evidence. And the work that I do in schools, what I oftentimes see is that we get the data, and then by the time we look at the data, the opportunity to really inform or change instruction has passed. And so we have all of these measures, and we might even have boards with like data walls and things like that. But what active actions are we taking based on that information? And it doesn't have to be whole school or whole district. Really, I think our most important formative assessment happens within the classroom, and is generated by the teachers and the students in that classroom. And students receive feedback about their learning while it's happening on what they can do to improve. And I want to talk about that in a moment. Those of you who have a literacy background like I do, when I started teaching in the late 80s, I'm really dating myself now, the writing process was brand new. That was a new way of looking at writing instruction. And one of the key components of it, if we had something like an instructional strategy like writer's workshop or such, the idea is that you give students feedback to develop their ideas and their understanding of content and be able to express that effectively in written text. And that was supposed to happen while the students were engaging in the writing process. And that's a really, I think, fundamental example of what we're talking about here, is that feedback is happening while the kids are learning. And it's never, ever, ever in the form of a number, of a percentage, or a letter grade, which is a very different way of thinking than many of us probably experienced as students and how we were trained as teachers as well as educators. And then students participate in that process throughout the assessment. I'm going to share a couple of schools and classrooms that I've been fortunate enough to team with and work with, and how students and their participation in the process really impacts their understanding of content and skills and their development of that, and how they're assessed and why that's important. So feedback and assessment is absolutely critical, and that students have to monitor their own learning. So that feedback, I've done webinars just specifically on descriptive feedback, and in your handout I have a blog post that I created on descriptive feedback. We can have a whole conversation just based on that, and that's worth doing and worth delving into, because it's such an amazing and critical impact on student learning. And of course, one of the things that I hear from colleagues all the time is, Katie, my student load is so high, it's very difficult to do that. But there are things that we can do in the way that we construct our classrooms and instruction to make that far more feasible. So when I started as a baby teacher in the late 80s, we were told to have writing, for example, writing conferences with students. Well, I taught middle school and high school, and I taught on the south side of Chicago, and my student load was 150 students. It was pretty much next to impossible for me to have individual writing conferences with 150 students. If I did that and had a 5-minute conference, it would take me probably close to a month to be able to conference with every student, and if I did that. But what I soon learned is that if I group kids based on certain topics or certain strengths or things that they needed to develop with their writing, I could have writing groups or conferences that way. And that was what I used in order to start giving back the feedback. So it doesn't always have to be one-on-one. I might be doing large group instruction, and a student, for instance, is going through presenting how his group solved a math problem. And if I look and say, hey, you know what? That is exactly, I like the way that you laid out that problem because of blank, blank, and blank following these practices. What would happen if I did this? And that's a way of giving feedback and also modeling for students how you think about your learning, how you think about what you did and why you do it. And that reflective piece, unfortunately, is oftentimes conspicuously absent in learning environments and instruction. And it happens to be really the key to learning and long-term internalization of what we've learned and what we understand. And of course, that's metacognition as well. So again, it's not just feedback, it's really helping kids understand how to understand the learning goals and assisting them to make judgments about their own learning. So I want to give you a quick example. This wonderful 7th grade teacher named Miss Allen, she teaches 7th grade in Washington State. And we had implemented literacy and learning centers. And one of her centers was the reflection center. And what she had was kind of a proficiency scale, but basically were the skills and the content that the students were working on in this 2-week unit. And the students had a folder with all of their work. And this classroom is very similar to many of the classrooms where we all teach. It has a wide variety of learners. There's a significant population of second language learners. So it really represents kind of a typical classroom. Anyway, there was a group of students who were at the reflection center. So being the nosy educator that I am, I said, hey, what are you doing here? Tell me about, the work that you're doing. And they said, well, we're going through our work. And Miss Allen, we have a list of all of the things that we're learning and the skills and the content knowledge. And if we have evidence that we've secured that skill or that content, then we highlight it green. If we think we have it or we partially have it, we highlight it yellow. If I don't have anything in my folder to prove that I've learned it or I've mastered it, then I make it pink. So then I asked the students, I said, what's the difference by you doing that as opposed to Miss Allen collecting all of your work and then she doing that and giving it back to me? And I love 7th graders because they just look at me like, really, lady? Don't you understand this? And they just kind of, well, because we're doing it. And I was like, yeah, no, I get that you're doing it. But why is that different than your teacher doing it? And they said, well, it's actually quite simple. Now I know what I need to do. I know what I've done and I know what I need to do. And that's really the secret sauce, because in that lies an immense amount of motivation. So if you're thinking, wow, I don't know if I could get kids in my school to do that, the answer is you can. How do you do that? It's modeling and showing kids how to do it. So what Miss Allen had done previous to this is that she had several times where she had a teacher-led center where she showed the students how to take this list of skills, and because it wasn't really a proficiency scale, these skills and the content knowledge that they had to secure and how they went about evaluating their own work to make the case of what they've learned and what they've accomplished and what they still need to do. So it's modeling. So we can't assume that they know. We have to show them. And this is a wonderful quote from Margaret Heritage, is that formative assessment is that process. It's used by teachers and students during instruction that provides feedback to adjust ongoing teaching and learning to improve students' achievement of intended instructional outcomes. And that's really the rub, right? Is that so often grading in particular is about compliance rather than providing a measure as to what students know and what they're able to do. And for me, that's particularly heartbreaking. And of course, there's been a substantial body of work. Alfie Kohn, his book, Punished by Rewards, if you haven't read it, I highly, highly recommend that. Really looks at how children of poverty in particular are impacted by A, B, C, D, and F grades. So, and it's also an equity issue as well. And that's a deeper conversation that we can have, but there's quite a bit to it. So before I go into these formative assessment blocks, I'm kind of checking over here, any questions, comments that you have. Charlton, I see, means feedback can happen right there while we were having a class. Yes, absolutely. So when you're having a class and you might be engaged in large group instruction, yes, you can say, for instance, a student presents a problem or makes a comment by saying something to the students like, hey, Charlton, I really like the way that you repeated what Amanda had just said. and built on what she said. And that's something that, you know, active listeners do, because I want to make sure that they're practicing that skill of active listening. So what I find is that, you know, you comment on what they're doing effectively and then extend it. That's the idea of descriptive feedback. Wow, you've got this. You acknowledge the previous speaker and summarize what they had. That's great, because that's a skill that we've been working on. And I love how you added on when you said blank, 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 blank. And then I'm modeling for students, but it's always generative. We always want to be generative, because quite frankly, when we say, oh, you didn't do this or you didn't do that, it fires the amygdala of the brain, which is your fight or flight. So when we're shouting or we're saying, don't do this, don't do that, it actually has the opposite effect of what we want to secure. So thank you. So please, you know, I'm going to keep checking the question area, comments, questions, things like that you might have there. Please post them in there. So let's look at these building blocks for just a moment with formative assessment, because it's going to build on my discussion of proficiency scales and standards-based grading in a moment. So learning progressions, those clearly articulate the trajectory along which students are expected to progress to improve in an area of learning and act as a touchstone for formative assessment. So those are like the big picture items that we want kids to be able to do along a continuum of those like 40 weeks of a kind of a regular 40-week school year. So we're checking those as we move along. Those are like the grade level articulations if you see in state standards. So oftentimes, for instance, in ELA, we'll have that students are able to make a claim and provide evidence, but what that looks like at the different grades and at different points in the year is what we're talking about. And then the next one is learning goals and success criteria. Well, if it's I need to be able to make a claim and use evidence to support that, that probably needs to be broken down, so that learning goals and success criteria is broken down even further. So you have that big progression, the big picture, and then the learning goals and success criteria fit under that umbrella. And they provide the standard for which performance is compared and feedback is generated. So I might say, I want students to be able to make a claim and provide evidence, okay? So I'm just looking for evidence and that it connects to their claim. But then later on, I might change that a little bit and say, okay, I want to make sure that you have effective evidence, that your evidence effectively connects with your claim. Because as we all know, all evidence is not created equal. So I want kids to start learning how to be judicious and discriminate about different kinds of evidence, what evidence to use, whatever other evidence that they might leave on the table. So that's what we're getting at. So we just start winnowing it down somewhat. And then, so as I said, that learning progression is the big picture and the learning goals is more of the immediate. Okay, so descriptive feedback, I've already talked about. That is the third building block, that descriptive feedback. I've already spoken about it somewhat. It's never, ever, ever, I'm going to say it again, in the form of a score or a grade. It's manifested in the skills, strategies, tasks, content that we're developing to get kids towards that next level of learning. So for example, if I want my students to start becoming more judicious about their evidence and how they use it to support a claim, that's what my descriptive feedback needs to focus on. So as teachers, as educators, as building leaders, district level, we all know that there's so much that we teach on a given day. But what are you focusing on at this point? And that's something in my work in schools and with other fellow educators, I have to keep reminding of them. It's like, okay, we're always teaching a lot of different skills, a lot of content, but what are we assessing on? What are we focusing on right now? So I want my kids to start really making judgments about the evidence that they use. So I might say to my students, hey, I see that you have five, or I say to a student, I see that you have 5 pieces of evidence here. I want you to rank order your evidence. What do you think is your most effective and your least effective, and why? And what I want you to do is that if you don't think it's really effective in supporting your claim, I want you to edit it out. And then if you don't have enough that supports your claim, then you've got to do some more research, and we have to do some more digging so we can beef up that argument. And so I want them to go to the next level, because I know many of you too are like me, where you've read the same student papers over and over and over again, and they know that they have to have 5 quotes because that's what the rubric says. And so they put 5 quotes in there, even though they have nothing to do with the topic or the claim or the thesis that they're trying to prove. Same things with science teachers too. They have the hypothesis, right, for the lab experiment, and then throw in all kinds of lab data, but it doesn't necessarily prove or disprove the hypothesis. They just know that they have to have it in there. And that's one of the limiting things about rubrics. Rubrics can be really effective, but that's my cautionary advice with that. They can be limiting as well. And remember, feedback is intended to improve learning while it's learning. So one of the things that I see over and over and over again, and many educators, and rightfully so, will complain about this, and that we have the spring assessment, and then we don't see the data until the following year. Well, what are you going to do with that data? Are you going to use it? If you had second graders who took that data in the spring, that same group of kids, are you going to use that then in the fall? Or do we need to have new data? It's best when it's on the spot, it happens right away. And with computer assisted kinds of assessments and things like that, if I have to do a large scale kind of thing, then I can use that data and start making adjustments right away. And I think that's one of the things that we struggle with the most. And that when the kids don't get it, what are you going to do? How are you going to remediate that? Okay. So, and then, as I mentioned, feedback, these are kind of my rules of the road here. It should be educational. It always should be referencing skills and developing content knowledge. So let me give you an example. A school that I've been working with, I've been looking at some of their, what they're calling proficiency scales, and they'll have things like the student uses the right heading, they followed all the directions, they cite correctly, and I said, okay, is that a skill in developing content knowledge, or is that a assignment direction or a compliance kind of thing? And we had to have some conversations about that and really go through the proficiency scales to make sure that we have that omitted. I said, that's something for the assignment. You can make that as a checklist, but that doesn't get at using the right heading, doesn't tell me whether or not the student understands scientific method or not. That's a compliance thing. That is not something that we measure. Okay, and so we had to have those kinds of conversations, and we want to make sure that we're guiding our kids, our students, toward that learning goal. These are some of the ones, since we're, so many of us are either hybrid or e-learning. These are some different Web 2.0 tools that I think are really helpful for giving descriptive feedback. I think one of the best one that's on the screen is Flipgrid, and some of you may already use Flipgrid as well. So I love that because it's very easy to make a quick video and give students feedback on their work. And Padlet is also good for that. Now Comment is particularly good for older students, like high school students as well. Okay, so all right, and then self-assessment and peer assessment is that next building block. And so when I gave you the example of Ms. Allen's class and how the students were evaluating their own work, they were discussing it in that small group, in that center that they were in the reflection center, and they were talking about each other's work, how it how they were meeting that continuum of skills and content knowledge that was being listed, and they had those discussions. And oftentimes I would hear in her class a student would say, no, we had that. Remember when we had this assignment here or this center? That's what this is. And the kids are having those conversations. So in a class like this, if you're really following those formative assessment building blocks, it should never be a mystery about how I'm performing in the class and what I'm learning and mastering at any given point. Okay, and then of course collaboration, and it's really that partnership between the students and the teacher, and having that feedback loop. Now, with elementary, when you have a smaller group of kids, that is happening on a regular basis. But, when we have middle school and high school, what I oftentimes tell teachers of students with larger class loads is, are you getting back to kids on a weekly basis? That should really be your goal. Are students hearing from you and that kind of regular rhythm, and getting feedback from you, and having those assessment signposts along the way to check their work and what they're doing. So it should not be a power struggle. I mean, that's what this really gets at. It shouldn't be about compliance and control. I think a lot of times grading is oftentimes used as punishment and reward, and it's incredibly problematic. For those of you who are still in a distance learning, e-learning environment, virtual learning, whatever we're calling it, or in your district or school, NWEA, Northwest Evaluation, has created a wonderful list. I also included it in your handout, the link for it. And they have a list for all these different online tools for checking student understanding. And I thought they did a fabulous job on it, so I wanted to make sure to share that resource with you. Okay. And here are some of the ones on that particular list that I really liked. Animoto, similar to Flipgrid, but this one is 30-second videos to share what they've learned and why it's important. You can use Animoto for that. And it could also be used as a tool for an e-learning turn and talk activity. So as an asynchronous kind of one. Another one that I just got exposed to is Marco Polo. So again, you're going to have to check with your district or your school to make sure that you're compliant with privacy and what's approved, but Animoto I think is really effective for that. I used to use Animoto back in the day when I was still on faculty at a university. I used to use that when I would go over students' unit plans or assignments, and I would give them extensive video or audio feedback while I was going through their work. So it was much more effective than all the comments and things that I could write on their papers. And I know AP teachers who use it as well. And then Edulastic, if you don't know about this one, where you can create a standards aligned assessment, and then teachers can get immediate student performance feedback and then adjust instruction as it's happening. So it's more in the moment. And then of course, any kind of survey like eSurvey Creator, using anticipation guides, evidence-based kinds of assessment, questionnaires. One of my favorite questions that I like to ask students as a metacognitive activity, and I do this with colleagues too when I'm providing professional development, is what did you learn and why is that important? And kids respond extraordinarily well to that, because it's not any specific thing. I'm not looking for an answer, but what did you learn and why is that important? And perhaps I'll ask you that at the end of today's webinar. What did you learn and how does that impact your thinking as an educator, as a building leader, district leader, a classroom teacher? And then Spiral is another one that I just learned about since the pandemic started, and it gives teachers access to formative assessments and be able to provide feedback. So I like Spiral a lot too. So that NWEA list is pretty extensive, but these are the ones that I've looked at that I thought are particularly great. And I usually share with colleagues that there's so much out there, it's like trying to drink from a fire hose, that the ones that I'm recommending are there's two important criteria. One, how fast can I get up and running? Okay, if it's super complicated and I'm still trying to figure it out after 2 hours, then it's not going to be a particularly good tool to use. And then the second is, does it serve the purpose? Is it going to serve my instructional need and benefit my students? Because there's a lot of things that are out there that are flashy and it's like, ooh, bright light, and I kind of, wander away. But is it really serving the purpose? And is it going to build good instruction, effective instruction? I want to talk a little bit about proficiency scales. And, oh, thanks, Carolyn, for letting me know that Edulastic is misspelled. Thank you so much. And what I'd like to ask you right now is what are you thinking right now about grading and assessment. What would you say is the biggest challenge that you have with grading and assessment? And, you know, pandemic or not, as I said, I think the pandemic exacerbates our challenges quite a bit. But you know, what are you learning so far? And this is kind of my stop point where I want to get some feedback from you and see, you know, how the content is resonating with you. So I'll give you a moment to do that. Yes, Charlton, what you're doing there, Charlton said, you know, so we could have a checklist of skills for a particular topic that maybe will last for a week or two, and students will support it with evidence, and it could be graded in a rubric. Yes, you could do it that way. I'm going to show you proficiency scales. The thing I like about proficiency scales is that it puts things on a the skills and the content knowledge on a continuum towards mastery, and it helps me to be very precise about the feedback that I'm giving students. So it becomes even more clear about the skills that we're focusing on. And it doesn't mean that we aren't teaching other things. We're always teaching other things. So that's why I find it kind of humorous when we say, oh, I want kids to, you know, closely read text. Well, it's not something that I just do in September. Every teacher does it every single day. But at what point am I assessing that? So the answer is yes, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Yeah, I really like Edulastic as well. Thank you so much, Carolyn. And then yeah, Charlton, are you a math teacher, I'm guessing? Perhaps. And Amanda is saying more project-based assessments where students can just Google answers from home, can't just Google answers from home, but actually need to take knowledge and apply it. Yes, 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 yes. And that's really the secret sauce, right? Is we want kids to deepen their content knowledge and know how to use it, how to manipulate it. I actually have done a couple of webinars on the reading achievement gap and what we can do about it. And what's become very clear is Natalie Wexler's book, The Knowledge Gap. I highly recommend it. I know everybody's swamped right now, but when you can come up for air, I highly recommend that. But really what's happening is that we've gotten so myopic about skills. We're not developing background knowledge. Social studies and science content in the United States in grades 1 through 3, less than 7% of students get social studies and science content. That's criminal. And we need kids to develop that content knowledge. That's where they also develop reading skills and reading comprehension as well, because vocabulary plus background knowledge equals comprehension. So Amanda, when kids are doing those proficiency, or not proficiency, when they're doing project-based learning, that's the penultimate, right? When you can use your critical thinking and all the knowledge that you have and your newly acquired skills and be able to address a really great, juicy question or problem, that is rocking as a teacher. And it's interesting too, because yeah, we don't want them to just look it up on Google. Like, what do you know and how can you use it to solve like real world problems and develop unique understandings? Okay. And then oh, good. Okay, Jennifer, thank you for that. How can we control cheating through online learning? Here's the thing, you can't. And it's just like, you know, in-person learning too. A colleague who I adore, this was years ago, maybe 15 years ago, we were talking about plagiarism and such. It's just something that just, you know, it always runs, you know, in not just K-12 education. I've had graduate students, you know, where I've had issues with plagiarism or cheating or whatever. You know, it's the game of your bad, my bad. Okay, so it gets to a point where what do you want to focus on? Is that a control compliance kind of thing, or you know, to what end? And so my thing is that yes, if it's really apparent, what I'm trying to get at more so is why were you compelled to quote unquote cheat or plagiarize? Why is it? And what I find is that when students get to that point where they feel that they need to cheat on something or they are plagiarizing, it's because they don't have the confidence of their skills or their knowledge, or they don't understand something. So to quote another wonderful colleague of mine, Patrick Schwartz, who's fantastic in special education, he always says, just remember that behavior is communication. So if you have a student who's plagiarizing or cheating, that's communication. What is that student telling you? And that is important for me as the educator or teacher to understand that, so I can be, improve that instruction. But I think that that's something that's always going to chase us. Fadi, you said, how do we convince parents with modern methods when all they want is an A for their kid? Absolutely, right. And then there's plenty of states and districts that require letter grades. In districts where I've seen, or schools where I've seen that they've made this shift and less emphasis on letter grades, and we start going into mastery and looking at the skills and the content knowledge, it required a process of several years, usually minimum 2 to 3 years, and having meetings with parents and making everything transparent and making sure that everybody understood this. Now, many of the schools that I work with, when we implement proficiency scales and go to more modern assessment, I haven't been in a state yet that didn't require A, B, C, D, F. But what happens is then it's very clear what an A means, a B means, a C means, a D means. But you're right. I mean, with parents and stuff, we have to educate them. Parents are still battling inventive spelling. The research has been so clear on that for over 20 years, and it seems that we're still battling that as well. Okay, and then Ken, thank you, says clear performance standards understood by students and used consistently by teachers. Yes, 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 as that consistency. And terminology for you is proficiency scales, and a generic term or is associated with one educator. I'm not quite catching that second question. Terminology for you is proficiency, a generic term, or is associated with one educator. Okay, and then yeah, I kind of guessed, Charlton, that you were a math teacher as far as checking kids, because it's a continuum as well. And yes, there will be a recording when you get the email tomorrow with your certificate. There'll be a link to the recording. So I want to talk a little bit about proficiency scales that have been largely popularized. A lot of you might be familiar with some work out there on proficiency scales. And the model that I'm using is very similar to what Bob Marzano promotes. And this is from a school district that I work with in developing proficiency scales. And I want to show you how it's different than a rubric. The first time I was exposed to rubrics was back in like 1992, and I was working on my master's degree. I was teaching full-time in Chicago, and I had a professor, Dan Pierce, who introduced me to the delights of rubrics, and it transformed my life as an ELA teacher. And what it helped me to do was just really focus on what I needed to focus on when I was evaluating student work. And I knew very clearly, based on Mia Shaughnessy's work, on her seminal work is Errors and Expectations, that when we write copious comments on students' papers, is that it has very little impact actually on improving. It's those discussions, it's those interpersonal relationships with students and those discussions that really can impact student learning, okay? So the way that it works is that there's a trajectory of complex goals and simple goals. Now, just to make it very clear that 4, 3, 2, and then I'm going to show you the next slide that has the next part of the scale, it doesn't equate to this is A, B, C, D, or F. That's not what it equates to. What it goes to is that if we look at the simple goals here, whoops, if we go to simple goals here, that's kind of the basic level of understanding. So when you look at this, that academic vocabulary review, for instance, those are words that the kids have already been exposed to, but we're reviewing them, okay? Now, are the kids just learning 6 words? No, they're learning a lot more, but these are the ones that we're assessing. These are the, you gotta know them words. And then if you look at the simple goals, S1, S2, S3, that it's more of like, can I use this? Can I verify? Can I demonstrate? And in parentheses, that is the particular state standard that we're addressing. Now, okay, so that's the simple goals. That's like the foundational knowledge or skills that I need in order to get to my complex goals. So it's a continuum. And that's why I like it, because what happens with rubrics, if I say, oh, you need to have 3 pieces of evidence, well, 3 pieces of evidence are going to go in, and that's it. I have 3. So I filled that bucket, I should get an A. Or I'll see rubrics that say something like, there are no more than 2 computational errors, and this is for Charlton. So there's no more than 2 computation errors. Well, as Charlton knows, as a math teacher, there's a big, like, wide range of computation errors. You know, one could be very simple, just like an oops, or one could demonstrate misunderstanding of a higher level concept. So that's where things can get problematic with rubrics. And actually, Ken O'Connor and Rick Wormley, Barb Marzano have all written about rubrics and what they can be used for, and what they're more suited for given the context. So then when we go into the complex goals, right? So we're looking at that continuum again. And remember that the topic at the top is word choice and meaning. So what I see when students start doing this, the best way to go about it is this, is that with colleagues, we start looking at proficiency scales and what they're intended to do. And then we start experimenting with them. And usually I provide some proficiency scales and we start working from there. So we can start getting our sense of how these actually work and how you use them to evaluate student learning. And then we're going to have to start creating our own or revising what we have to make sure that they're meeting our needs. And the other thing is that they're on public display. Kids see them in the classroom, they're discussed, they are referenced quite a bit. So after about a year or so, what I'll see is I'll go into classrooms, even as young as first grade and second grade, and I'll say, oh, what are you working on? And kids will say to me, well, I secured, you know, that simple goal and this simple goal and this one. So right now I'm working on C2 and this is what I'm doing. And we know that when kids are able to articulate what they're learning, why they're learning, that there is a deepening and an internalization that can occur. The other thing too is that the districts that I've worked with, all of the proficiency scales, everything is like public document. Any parent can go and look at it so they know, oh, okay, it's October, this is the proficiency scale that they're working on. And for teachers, for classroom teachers in particular, it's about the skills you're developing. It's, notice that I don't say that, it doesn't say here, you're going to use this, you're going to use this, you can use, it doesn't matter what I create as an instructor. I can use different content as a vehicle to develop the skills and the content that is in this proficiency scale. So here's another example. If I'm teaching scientific method and I want to teach about fungus, but my colleague is going to delve more into ecosystems, we might have nuances of content, but we're still developing what is in that proficiency scale. So, like I said, this is very much in depth. We're just kind of hitting that, and I want to put the seeds in there to start thinking about, thinking differently. That it's not what most of us experienced as students, where there's a grid with all these numbers and assignments, and then a tally at the end. And I want to kind of end it with something that both of my kids, I have two very, very different kids. And my daughter, when she was in school, she was at a school where there were no letter grades. So I actually received a portfolio, and I received similar to a proficiency scale of these are the skills and the content that we're working on in this quarter. This is what your daughter has secured. This is what she's working on. These are the goals that we want her to have for next quarter. My son, on the other hand, who is has autism, and he had a very different report card. His report card was all letter grades. I struggled to find out what he had secured, what he hadn't secured. I had to rely a lot on his IEP and look at that. But even then, it was difficult for me to find out what he had secured, what he had developed, and what did he need to work on and move towards. And it was very frustrating for me, and to see such the difference of that. And the other thing too is that it was very motivating for, I see it over and over and over again, that when we make this shift and we focus on what do you know and what are you able to do rather than A, B, C, D, or F, it's highly motivating. And I'm not the only one who has written about that, who has documented it. There's quite a group of collective thinkers that document that over and over and over again. And I always equate it to this, is that, yeah, maybe I learned that way as a student, or that was my experience as a student, and this is what I know. But you know, that Model T, that was a great car. That Model T was a great car when it came out. But I don't know about you, I really like driving my Mini Cooper. So I've been in the profession for over 30 years. I really hope I don't teach like I did in 1988 as a baby teacher, that my knowledge has expanded and we know so much now about how to improve learning while it's happening, so our students can be far more successful. So that's really, you know, my argument about, you know, the proficiency scales and about looking at a modern classroom and grading. And I think really the proof is that, you know, back in the spring at the height of the pandemic, in May, you know, everybody was scratching their head as far as how do we grade students? Well, you can't grade students the way that we've always thought that they should be graded. It's really about the power of their skills, their developing knowledge. That's what's so incredibly motivating. So I think I can take a couple of questions. I had already let me just say this, one more shout out about descriptive feedback is that I like little formulas, you know, that's kind of like my math side too, because, you know, I love math as well. Vocabulary plus background knowledge equals reading comprehension. Descriptive feedback plus student understanding, okay, that's what really gets to effective instruction. That's the secret sauce. So that descriptive feedback, student understanding and accomplishment and mastery, that's how I know as an educator that I'm effective, okay? So let me take a couple, I see Maura, you've got a question there. Yes, they're a great fit for specialist class. And as I shared, I have complete pre-K all the way through 12th grade ELA proficiency scales. If you want some more information about different subjects, just email me directly and I'd be more than happy to talk to you about those as well. And they're really great too. I wrote one of my books, there's a chapter in it about the impact of proficiency scales on students with special needs and the positive impact in a particular school district in New Mexico. And that's the other thing too, because the way that you can develop those proficiency scales is that they're vertically and horizontally aligned, and that's huge. Yes, absolutely, Maura, is that proficiency scales for spiraling curriculum for specialist teachers? Yes, 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 exactly. That's how you're thinking of it, is exactly right on target as well. So what I'd like to do is, if you have any questions or comments or need more resources, I'd love to hear from you. And you can reach me at that email. And also in my biography, that handout, I also have my email address in there as well. So please feel free to email me. And remember that 24 hours after the broadcast, I'll send you an email with a link to the on-demand recording of this webinar. And also you'll receive your certificate of attendance. So just wrapping it up today, thank you for taking that hour out of your time today. I hope you have a great rest of the afternoon and evening. And I always end every single webinar with this is before I turn it over to my friends with ACD to see if they have any closing comments, is that I just want to thank you for all that you do on behalf of students every day. And Russ, I see that you're there, so let me get you on there. Okay, Russ, your mic should be live. Oh, maybe not. Wait, let me do this one. See that you're there twice. There we go. I think I got you now. Russ, any closing words for today?
Thank you. That was fantastic, Katie. Extremely beneficial and helpful. Especially with a son of mine that is needing this kind of help. It's extremely helpful personally. So thank you. Always a pleasure to listen to what you have to say.
So thank you so much, Russ. And again, ACD, they're a wonderful partner, and the work that they do, and that we really share that common belief that all children are entitled to an outstanding education. So again, thank you for all that you do on behalf of students every day, and look for that email in 24 hours. And again, thank you. Have a great day.